This video was brought to you by Enniskillen Castle Museums. October is a great month for people who find the paranormal fascinating. It's a time when spooky stories and ghostly tales are remembered. Here at Fermanagh TV, we thought we would research into Fermanagh's rich history and uncover the many stories that have been passed down through generations. Local historians Fankie, Roofe and Catherine Scott will narrate the many tales from a Dander through the streets book that was published nearly 30 years ago. Be warned though, you may never walk the streets of Enniskillen alone again.
Most of the stories that are written about in this publication were stories that were told sitting at the fire before televisions, and especially around Halloween, when it was a time for people to go visiting in Aislinn and telling ghost stories, and for children out around the streets dressed up for Halloween in their fancy outfits and knocking at the doors and asking for any Halloween nuts, apples or coppers, whatever was going, whatever they could get, the children took. And most of the parents sat while the children done that up and down the streets that they lived in the old streets in the town. All the old streets in the town, even north, south, east or west, But basically the stories that we're telling are from the old Dardanelles, the old streets, the back streets as they call them here in the town.
Just touching on that is the poem, Jerry Quinn's poem on the Dardanelles and the soldiers that he talks about in his poetry, and meeting at the shore, the number of men in the First World War who would have died who came from the Dardanelles area. The back streets assumed the names the Dardanelles because of the number of men from the area who fought in Gallipoli, and it became almost a derogatory name for the town.
That's right.
And then subsequently, one of the poems which Jerry Quinn penned was about some of these soldiers who had died during the First World War. I suppose in Jerry's memory as well, it could have been the Second World War. He could have been referring to more than likely the First World War. The poem is simply called Ghost. When gas lamps lit each corner from the bracket or stand, 'twas always pitch black in between, and young people, 'twas said, became grey in the head because of the ghosts to be seen. There was one by the barracks halfway up the lane, a soldier with sword by his side, with a hole in his head from a big lump of lead. 'Twas plain to see how he died. As he turned into Head Street, he met with his friend, a tall figure dressed all in black, and they walked to the shore where they met 20 more, for the banshees for O and for Mac.
The area where Catherine's mother grew up was just beside the castle here, and they said that the ghost of the soldier that was supposed to be patrolling up and down outside the gate was in old army uniform from the ancient times, and it was said that he was the ghost of a soldier that was killed by another soldier inside the castle grounds, and that's why he haunted the gate.
It would make perfect sense for there to be the ghost of a soldier in an area like Enniskillen Castle where soldiers were stationed, for hundreds of years, and for that whole area of the town where so many soldiers lived for so long, and I suppose where so many people died, where life expectancy was poor, where living conditions were poor, children died young, infant mortality was high. So there were a lot of people who had died in the streets, and presumably, whether you believe in ghosts or not, their energy, their entity may have lingered, I suppose.
Yeah, and they believed that the spirits on Halloween came back to the areas, and they said that there was that many people had died in the streets that the spirits were thick on the ground. So one of the traditions was that they never threw out slop water into the old yards and down the old drains at night time because there was that many spirits around.
The spirits of dead soldiers were not the only type of ghoul the locals had to contend with. Banshees, with their dreaded cry, were also feared by town and country dwellers.
The last line of Jerry's poem picks up sort of the banshees calling for O and for Mac, and I think I'm right in thinking that people or surnames preceded with O and for Mac. They're the names most associated that banshees would have called for. Frankie earlier on related a story to me about a young boy who was out with his grandfather, seen by a man returning from work.
Yeah, a night shift worker coming home to the old streets, and as he was coming home, the mist was descending on the lake and coming up from the shore and covering the old streets of the town. And as he proceeded to, down Strand Street, he he met a neighbour of his, an old neighbour of his, walking with his grandson, and in the early hours of the morning, and he thought it was very strange that this child was out so late at night or so early in the morning, and he really never thought anything more about it, and he went to bed that night, and he was woken by his wife the next day and told that the child had died during the night. Those are the stories that were told, and the sound of the banshee, as Catherine said, was heard, or said to be heard, and followed the families with O and with Mac, so O'Brien's or MacBrien and McGovern and MacGovern, and depending on where these people came from and what area they came from was how the name was pronounced. So the Mac was used as MC and MSC, so there's O'Reilly's and there was different names like that would have been living in the old streets.
Yeah. I was just thinking as well in terms of other kind of things as well as the banshee, people would recount sort of like hearing the ticking of a clock that isn't there, and sort of noises that might sort of be omens or sort of like a token that death somewhere is imminent in the streets. And the banshee was very common and obviously heard throughout the community, but even within homes people associated sounds that something sort of really not nice or a death was imminent in the family.
One area of the streets where the banshee was said to be heard was Hanson's Garage, an old garage in Head Street, and the sound would have been always heard coming from that area. And we didn't know, as children growing up in the streets, we didn't know whether it was just to keep us away from Hanson's Garage, that it was a scare tactic by the parents or whatever, but these stories were always told, and the names of these places were always brought out all the time.
In this day and age, many people do not believe ghosts exist, but the folks in these stories are people that Frankie knew as a child. He can remember grown men terrified of one building in particular.
That old hotel in my time was tenanted by two different families, and they created a second part of the house by opening a door on a side street. But there was said to be somebody murdered in that house way back in the 1800s. And that there was a ghost in that house, and in order for some people to live in it, that many things had happened down through the years in the house itself, that no family would live in it, yet it was a brilliant big house. And in order for a family to move into it, they brought a priest down, and the priest was said to have housed the spirit or the whatever inside a cupboard in the house, and locked it, and it was never to be opened. And when it came to this time period of the 60s, whenever all the people moved out of the street, the last house to be knocked down in the street was that one, and the men that were on the job refused to knock it down because they were all local men. And a man who was in the gang of men that were working with them, who was a stranger to the town, who had come in to work, live in the town and married into the town, said he would knock it down, and as he did, a brick fell from the top of the building and hit him on the head. Now he wasn't killed, but he's quite badly injured at the time, but he wasn't killed. Now that's part of the story of the old hotel from Strand Street. So.
The back streets of Enniskillen were not the only place to encounter ghostly beings. The country folk, as Catherine calls them, also had many unexplained experiences.
The story that comes to my mind is one that I read in relation to Thomas Plunkett, not in Enniskillen necessarily, but Thomas Plunkett, who was the chairman of the town commissioner, and people associate largely with Fort Hill and the bandstand there. He was called to visit upon a house now beyond sort of what we would recognise as Enniskillen, out in the country, whereby there was a central room in the house and 4 children, I think. There was an older girl and her 3 younger siblings. And the parents experienced that every night when the children went to bed, all these noises and strange sorts of movements started to happen. And Plunkett, for some reason or another, he was well regarded as an antiquarian, and he was called upon to visit the house. And the children were settled, and they went in and checked that the 4 children were asleep, and they were. And they sat in the room again, and these noises continued. I think this happened for like a period of it's well documented, 1 or 2 weeks, and they checked outside, and I'm afraid I don't have a brilliant end to this story. Even after that period of time, and I think then in the 2nd week a priest came along, they could not resolve where these noises were coming from. I think they had thought it might have been the older girl, but she was sound asleep in her bed, along with her brother, sister, and they never really came to any conclusion or any resolve as to where all these noises were coming from. I think, Frankie, there's another one of their travelling ghosts to America.
Yeah, well, one from another part of the county really, which was Cunyon, which is a famous ghost. People from all over the world are aware of the Cunyon ghost and what happened. Everybody has different scenarios to what actually happened at the end of it, you know. But in the house, which is still standing in Cunyon, the family that lived there was a Murphy family, and strange happenings were happening on a nightly and a daily basis sometimes. And what happened was they reckoned that it was a type of a poltergeist where things moved about the room and flew about the room, and people could feel hands in their throat and hair brushing against their face, and different things all the time, you know. And this family became very, very, very stressed out and annoyed because of it, and they had nowhere else to go, so finally they emigrated and they went to America. And the story that's told in the locality and has been told down through the years is that the ghost actually followed them all the way to the ship to America and travelled with them on the ship, and there were strange happenings on the ship as well. But when the people landed at the docks in America, there were that many people in the docks at the time that the ghost seemingly lost track of the family and disappeared somewhere in America. So somewhere in America, in some of the hills, the Cunyon ghost is still roaming, you know. So.
Frankie may laugh, but the tale of the Cunyon ghost, amongst others, were believed by the Fermanagh people 100%.
I mean, if you were talking to some of the old people that I grew up as a child listening to, telling these stories, I mean, they're the people that seen these things happening. They're the people that would have related these stories to perfection, where the hair would have been standing on the back of your head, and that the story would have went on and on and on. I mean, we're telling you the basics and the very, very basic of the story, but they could tell you the story from the start to the finish.
I think because we're saying it from the third person, you know, this didn't happen to us, but when this book was first put together, Bernadette Layden, who brought it all together, working with people who lived in the streets, they were telling it either from personal experience or their nanny or their mommy had told them. You know, to go back to your question as to whether or not it's important to keep all of this alive and to keep the heritage of it alive, the answer obviously coming from me is yes. And oral history is a wonderful way to sort of disseminate any kind of information about, in this instance, the old street, but we're also learning about the war, we're learning about kind of superstitions, we're learning about traditions, and we're learning about all types of things just by looking at something as simple as ghosts and whether or not they exist or we believe in them or not. So yeah, I think it's important that Frankie and I sit here and talk about ghosts. It would be obviously, as we say, better if, I suppose, people who are long gone would be here recounting what they saw, you know, and heard and saw and heard and footsteps and, you know, and what they felt. You know, there's absolutely no way you could relate how scared somebody felt.
Yeah, I mean, another story that we sort of have overlooked at the minute is that in Head Street there was a coaching house, and the story attached to that coaching house down through the years, which I never knew, and Catherine, as far as I know, we haven't been able to find which house it was in, but we think it was a big 3-story house at the top of Dame Street that was in Head Street, right beside Hanson's garage, I might add, was the old coaching house. And they said that the headless coachman drove the horses down the street, only people could hear the sounds, but the horses were always in the air, and so was the coach. It was never touching the stone.
And the coach was drawing a hearse.
It was drawing a hearse, and you know, this headless man was driving this hearse, and that went up and down all the streets. It wasn't just somebody from Dame Street telling it, or from Mary Street, or from Abbey Street, or from Strand Street, or from Riverview, which is in your area, but it was all the streets related to the same story, because when it was seen, it went up and down them all.
Are these stories fact or fiction, or were they told to keep young children in check? Or were they first-hand experiences passed down through generations with a little bit added on each time they were told? We may never know, but I can tell you this, I won't be hanging about to find out. Situated on the banks of the River Erne, the castle was built almost 600 years ago by the Gaelic Maguires. The historic site houses 2 museums and is a great day out for all the family. For more information, go to enniskillencastle.co.uk.